It's June, man. I'm dying to make it down.
Yeah, yeah, it's slowed down a lot. It's like the old regular slow. You can actually turn left on the highway.
Hey guys, we're live. Welcome to the Art of the Live broadcast. I'm Eve Samples, Executive Director at Friends of the Everglades, and I want to welcome our audience to our clean water conversation about the trouble or apparent trouble in Florida Bay. We have a really interesting conversation planned today. Before I introduce our guests, I want to tell you a little bit about Friends of the Everglades. We were founded in 1969 by Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. We're very proud of that legacy. And actually, this year we're celebrating the 75th anniversary of Marjorie's book, The Everglades River of Grass, which really changed the world's perception of this ecosystem that we love so much. And of course, Florida Bay is a really important and vital part of that ecosystem. And that's what we're going to focus on today. Before we get to our guests and the topic at hand, just want to say a word about Hurricane Ian. We were actually going to host this live stream 2 weeks ago, and Hurricane Ian disrupted those plans and disrupted so much else across our state, especially in Southwest Florida. And it really felt like a statewide trauma, I think, for a lot of us, of course, in terms of the human impact and the impact on the built environment. But the environmental impacts are really going to be something that we assess over time, and we're beginning to, and we're going to touch on that today. So I'm just going to pull up one quick slide and then introduce our panel here to show some imagery from pre and post Ian. On the left, September 22nd, you can see NOAA satellite imagery before Ian, and October 1st, 2022 shows that sediment and runoff from the land in Southwest Florida really mixed and created this kind of watercolor image there. So just beginning to assess that, and we'll come back to the images. But first, I want to introduce our panel. So with that, I would like to first introduce Captain Steve Friedman. Steve is a full-time fishing guide in Islamorada. He serves as Commodore and on the board of directors for the Florida Keys Fishing Guide Association, a wealth of knowledge about Florida Bay, which is the topic at hand today. So Steve, we want to welcome you. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Dave Preston is an avid fly fisherman and outdoorsman. He spent a lot of the 80s and 90s exploring the waters of Florida Bay, the Everglades, and Biscayne Bay. And he also serves as a member of the board of directors of our organization, Friends of the Everglades, as well as Florida Wildlife Federation. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Steve. Honored to be here today.
Thanks. And Dr. Jennifer Rehaj is a coastal and fish ecologist and associate professor at the Institute of Environment and the Earth and Environment Department at Florida International University. She's also a member of Friends of the Everglades Policy and Science Committee. We want to welcome you today, Dr. Rehaj. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure.
Absolutely. So I'm going to cue back up our slides and just orient our audience, some of whom may know Florida Bay intimately, others who may be more casual observers. And I want to talk about the ecosystem we're going to discuss today. Florida Bay contains about 10% of the world's seagrass. It's one of the most beloved fisheries in the world. But it has been really challenged over the decades by an imbalance of saltwater and freshwater. And a lot of this is due to man-made disruptions of Florida's natural drainage system, that river of grass that Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wrote about, that once meandered from Lake Okeechobee down to the southern Everglades and out into Florida Bay, delivering needed fresh water. Of course, that was disrupted when Florida was developed both agriculturally in the EAA here and also through the built environment. So that's a lot of what we're grappling with today. These salinity imbalances can create a cycle of disruption. Too much salinity can lead to seagrass die-offs and in turn algal blooms, which we're going to discuss. And this can harm the fisheries and other species, wading birds, mammals. There can be a domino effect that can be really damaging to this ecosystem. And after the 2017 Hurricane Irma, that basically raked up the middle of Florida's peninsula and right across the Keys, there was a bloom that emerged and has lingered. So our attention at Friends of the Everglades was really drawn to this when we got up in an airplane with our partners at Lighthawk, another nonprofit, just to get some images of the air to survey the ecosystem. Our photographer, Leah Voss, captured these images. And on the surface, these were from August, they look really beautiful, right? Some of those teal colors that people are accustomed to seeing in the Keys and Florida Bay. But as we got to talking to Dr. Rehaj, she pointed out that this is the algal bloom that we've been plagued with in the Bay. So these pictures indicate the color there. And Dr. Rehaj, I just want to pass it to you to kind of describe what we're seeing in these images.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of floating sediment in that western part of the bay. Due to seagrass loss that started with the 2015 hurricane and seagrass loss that's been occurring in that western part of the bay, we have tons of loose sediment that were really poignant in that previous image. You can see it here also. You can see that wind direction and those wind lines. And you can see all that sediment being kicked up, and that sediment prevents light from reaching the bottom, and it's really detrimental to seagrass coming back. You can see it. Yeah, that's a really good one. Here we're seeing a mix of that sediment and the water column. You can see the direction of the wind a little bit, and here's mixed in with some bloom. And we have the central bay bloom that mixes with this western sediment, making for very poor water quality conditions for the bay.
And this is Cormorant Key, right? For those who might know the area well.
Yeah, a little bit more of organic matter being sort of, what did you call it, Steve?
Nastiness.
Yeah,
general nastiness.
Yeah, you can see that burnt water. Something is decomposing, maybe a little bit of seagrass, floating seagrass, perhaps mixed in with. We have lots of sargasso, right? That's been coming into our coast in the summertime, and that decomposing is adding nutrients, which doesn't help the situation.
Okay, so thanks for explaining that to our audience, and thank you for helping us at Friends of the Everglades understand what we were seeing when we came back with these images after that flight in August. And of course, after Hurricane Ian, we were very interested in finding out what the effects may or may not have been. But before we get to that, I want to ask you, Jen, to tell us a bit more about the history of what's been going on in Florida Bay. You know, you're a fish ecologist, you study the effects of natural and man-made impacts on fisheries, and you've really paid close attention to this ecosystem for many years. And algal blooms are not a new phenomenon in the Bay, but this current bloom has been lingering really since Hurricane Irma and appears to be different. So can you tell us what's happening there, when it started, and what impacts it's been having?
These images are very telling of that large sort of, you can see that swath of greenery in the middle part of the bay. It originates on the mangrove line on that rim of the bay, and then it just goes out, and you can see it pop it out east of the Keys and on the ocean side through the channels there. So we've had a new establishment of algal blooms that have been recurring since the 2015 seagrass die-off, and then the 2017 Hurricane Irma. And these images that you have here are conditions after those events. And I should say the blooms were particularly bad right after. They were the worst in the fall and spring 2017 and 2018, immediately after Hurricane Irma. There's a lot of things being kicked up, and a lot of that flared a really intense bloom. And those blooms have been getting better every year. We're now at 4 years out from the hurricane, and we were all encouraged because every year it's been getting a little bit better in the bloom site, still having those blooms, but they've been fall blooms. They start in September, and then as the water gets a little bit colder and it sort of this algae likes it really hot and conditions get cool, then we see a dieback of that lessening of that algal bloom in January, February. But this year, 2021, 2022, the bloom started a little bit later in November, and it just got going really strong, and it lingered all year round, all of our spring, and never died back in the winter. And it went into the summer, and we have now continuous blooming conditions since last November, October, November, that continues today, and now probably are going to continue on because now we're starting, the start of our bloom season.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really alarming that it spanned the whole off season when you expected to get a break. And just for a little more kind of historical context, I'm going to cue to this next slide, which talks about previous blooms. And thank you for providing this, Jen. You know, the seagrass die-offs previously in the Bay have been really devastating. And is what you're witnessing now comparable to that, or is it a different beast?
The seagrass, the good news is the seagrass has been recovering well since 2015. So we're seeing strong recovery. All of our basins have different degrees of recovery. However, that big plume that we were looking at, that big sediment plume that's on the western side in Flamingo Channel, that's depriving the bottom from getting light, and it's going to really hamper seagrass recovery. So that's a big concern, that now we have not just the algal bloom, but the sediment that's floating, because it's just floating sediment because we have more sediment inputs along the shoreline. We've lost the mangrove coverage on the shoreline. We have some ditches that are discharging sediment, and we have sediment resuspended because we lost the grass that holds on to that sediment. Super important part of what grasses do. All of that sediment's floating around, and now it's mixing with the algal bloom, and it's really affecting light levels, which are going to affect the trajectory of that recovery that we're going to see in the future, in the years to come, as we come out of this event.
Mm-hmm. And I want to ask you about one more slide, and then we'll turn to Captain Steve to get some kind of on the ground impressions of what's happening. But this shows how salinity has plummeted and spiked over the years. And can you explain to us how that ties in with the conditions you're describing?
Yeah. So I wanted to highlight this, that despite that, what you're seeing here is that blue line in the center, salinity of seawater. Anything that above is saltier as seawater, which is a big concern. We call that hypersalinity, and those are conditions that are not favorable for fish. Trout, for instance, suffer stress starting at 45, which is 10 units more than the 35 of seawater. And you're seeing that in the central part of the bay, every year it gets too salty. And then you can see that huge spike from 2015 drought, where we almost reached double the seawater salinity. That was a really extreme event that caused our seagrass to die. And one of the things that is highlighted in these little symbols, hurricane symbols with Irma and Eta, is that we're seeing the freshest conditions in the bay with these hurricanes. So it's sort of a trade-off. Hurricanes might be prompting some algal blooms because they're releasing and kicking up nutrients, and they're killing a little bit of biomass. But they're also giving us really freshwater conditions that are not achievable at the moment. We're not seeing those. And if we even go back in history, 2004, those spikes, when it really drops down, those are all hurricanes. And hurricanes provide us with the fresh water we desperately need. So it's sort of a trade-off. We're getting hurricanes that promote freshwater deliveries, that promote fish spawning. The fisheries we have today are a result of Irma spawning events. But we also get a little bit of blooms.
Thank you so much. So Captain Steve Friedman, I want to ask you about the conditions that you're seeing from your perspective on the water. You've been a guide in and around the bay for a long time. How does what Dr. Rejas just described translate in terms of your ability to take out anglers, and what are you seeing in the fishery?
Well, I've learned a lot from Dr. Jen about these situations and the good that can come from them. For instance, shortly before we had a massive freeze in 2010, we were catching lots of 15 to 17 inch snook and redfish. Then that seemed to drop off. And then really it wasn't until Irma that apparently blew in a bunch of these juvenile snook. I think the fishing really started to get outstanding, to where they even went to the lengths of lifting moratoriums on harvesting snook because of the devastation that freeze took. So I know we're talking about storms and runoff. One of the concerns, and one of the things I'm seeing right now, just from a layman's perspective, is the bait from the habitat that's lost. I am not a scientist, but I truly believe in my heart that seagrass die-off was considerably more than what's been documented. And I think it's because it continued to die years afterwards, whether it's because of how Jen described the coverage and not being able to get sunlight or what have you. So it is a give and take. The fact that we have been witnessing this latest bloom in Florida Bay in the central part, which is where it gets the least amount of movement, current, since she said November. I was noticing it in December. Is really concerning, and there were a lot of us that were really kind of learning that, hey, maybe we need something to move this out. We need some wind, we need some rain, we need some storms. And as we all know, we're living down in South Florida, at least in the Keys, because it can be a very different weather system 80 miles north in Miami. We weren't really getting a lot of rain and a lot of water. Now, other guides that work out of the mainland that maybe drive to Flamingo, that live in Homestead and Florida City, I've been speaking with them, and they've got theories that they're getting too much fresh water. If you're driving in the park or you're driving along 41, that water has swelled to conditions that we haven't seen in quite some time. And so, we keep saying, send it south, and we seem to be getting it. And I don't necessarily adhere to that theory that it's too much fresh water that's leading this algae bloom. What I understand is that it's not something coming from the Everglades. It's not coming from any result of the Everglades projects. It's simply something that we're unfortunately going to have to get used to on an annual or semi-annual basis, where these blooms are going to pop up because of this recovery process that the bay is going through right now.
Jen, you look like you wanted to chime in on that.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Steve. We're not getting nutrients from that fresh water that's coming in. By the time it gets to us, it's so clean, it doesn't have any nutrients. Other places, it's not the case, but we're so lucky because it's gone through the Everglades. The Everglades, every piece of grass is harnessing any little nutrients that it has. By the time it enters the bay, it's really, really clean. So we just have nutrients left over because we don't have enough seagrass to take up. Seagrass are so good about harnessing nutrients, and the minute we lose seagrass cover, and I think you're completely right, I think the extent of the seagrass die-off is much larger than what we documented scientifically, because we only monitor like a handful of basins. And you guys know better, and I know that you guys have documented much extensive seagrass beds in areas that we don't expect to see it, and later as well. And as we lose the capacity for those seagrasses to harness nutrients is really wonderful. And the minute we lose seagrass biomass, it means that we have nutrients somewhere in the water column that are available for algae. So that's really unfortunate. So getting that seagrass back is critical as fast as we can.
It's also kind of interesting to note too that typically this time of year we're experiencing right now are the big king tides. So we have a tremendous amount of water in the bay right now, and so I don't know if it's not flushing as much in this time of year, because our lowest of lows, the flats are not exposed, whereas in the wintertime those flats get exposed. The flats heat up. There's a different concentration of movement, both in water and temperature. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it. That's just something that is, part of the moon cycle that we have every year this time of year.
Jen, do you think Steve, you mentioned the king tides. I've noticed just anecdotally that on these big tides where you have a ton of water rushing in and rushing out, it creates a lot of turbulence and seems to kick up a lot of that sediment and create suspended sediment. Do you think those king tides are, by that roiling effect, contributing?
I think that could be a factor. If anything that allows more sediment resuspension, we're going to get a little bit greater depth right with those tides. It's going to prevent light from reaching the bottom, and then we're going to get some resuspension of that sediment over and over that prevents the light from getting to the bottom and allowing seagrass to recover. Now, also in the fall, we're entering, the days are a little bit shorter, so conditions are not as good for seagrass growth. And we'll see that seagrass growth kicking as the days get longer, and the conditions are more favorable for algae, because the seagrasses it's so expensive for them to maintain all that biomass. Most of the biomass is below ground. 90% of a seagrass is below ground, and you see a few leaves, but they have to sort of conserve all of that giant biomass that it's not photosynthesizing below ground. So it's really expensive, and they struggle when there's low light conditions. And as the day gets shorter, it becomes more favorable for the algae to take up any nutrients available.
Steve, I want to ask you a question about hurricanes in general, and you alluded to this. There's some conventional wisdom that storms can help the bay, can help break up an algae bloom or deliver needed fresh water. I'm going to pull up an image here that the Miami Herald published from a flight just in the last few days with Lighthawk also. And it shows a blowout here along the coast of Cape Sable from excess rain and storm surge after Ian just a couple weeks ago. So I'm just wondering what your take is, on the ground in terms of what storms in general do to conditions in the bay and what you've seen since Ian in particular.
Well, I mean, just from a sight fishing perspective, it makes it more difficult. It's going to churn up the bottom and make sight fishing more challenging. That's also the case anytime we really get any kind of breeze in the bay right now, because there's no grass to hold in that sediment. So we've been seeing some improvements in the bay with some water clarities around Flamingo, but then as soon as the wind kicks up to a normal 15 knot wind, it's very difficult to see because it churns up that sediment. I think it's also interesting to note that, fish don't necessarily mind nutrients. That's why you have big bass that feed in pipelines and things like that. So as far as the fish are concerned, it's not necessarily a bad thing unless it's bringing toxic runoff. That could be poisonous. That's whether it's the cyanobacteria that might harm their physiology, or whether it's going to kill off the prey that they're going to be living on. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen here along the coast with this unprecedented flushing of water that's coming off the southwest coast that will inevitably come back around the corner and affect us in some way. How that's going to be, a negative or a positive, I'm not clear yet.
Got it.
Pardon the pun.
And Dave, I want to turn to you. So you've been fishing Florida Bay since you were a kid, and you've talked to me about how past hurricanes have actually helped in some regards in terms of abundance of fish with specific species, at least for a time. Tell me, what you've seen out there over the years in terms of storm impacts and how you think Ian might impact the area.
Sure. Look, I'm just a amateur angler and
champion Gold Cup winner twice.
Champion is right, twice.
Bonafides.
I try to spend as much time in Florida Bay as I possibly can. It's one of my biggest goals in life, to spend as much time out there as I can. I think my first trip out to Florida Bay was in maybe 1984. I was 6 years old, and my dad took me down to the Keys, and we went out with Roy Crabtree out of Lorelei, who's a state, I think he's still a state biologist, right, Jen? And we went over to Snakebite and one of the finger channels, and we staked off, and we threw jigs and shrimp and popping corks for, 6 hours, and caught something on every cast. I mean, it was absolutely unbelievable, the amount of life out there. We caught snook and redfish and trout and flounder and pompano. I mean, it was wild. The whole flat just poured off into the finger channel, and we caught fish till our arms fell off and we were ready to go home. And we got back, and my dad said, "Hey, this is the greatest thing ever. We should try to find a house down here to come down here on the weekends from Miami." And we did for the next 20 years, and we got a little 17-foot aqua sport, and that's what we do on the weekends is run across the bay to Flamingo. And it was a little different kind of fishing than I do now, but it was amazing. And it's what I grew up doing, and I just grew a love for that place. It's just incredibly special. I've seen a lot of changes to the bay over the years. The 80s was incredible. The bay was pretty pristine. There was not a lot of boat traffic, or probably relatively less pressure than there is now. Fishing was really good. I just remember one day we took our boat across the bay. We had a live well full of pilchards that we caught in the Keys, and we got to one of the keys out front of Flamingo. I think it was Palm Key, to snook fish, and we opened the live well, and all the pilchards were dead. And it had happened. What happened was we ran across Central Florida Bay, and that was the late 80s algae bloom, the start of it, and it killed all our bait. And at the time we were like, what happened? We didn't know. And that was, really, that was a major collapse of Florida Bay that lasted for several years. And it took the bay, it's probably a 10 to 15 year cycle of recovery from a major seagrass die-off and algae bloom like that. It seemed like to me, again, anecdotally, and I try to talk to as many scientists as I can. And, I'm fortunate now to be on the board of Friends of the Everglades, and we do have great relationships with the great scientists who dedicate their lives to figuring out what's going on out there. So I do ask a lot of questions. I probably drive them crazy sometimes, but I do make an effort to try to match up what I'm seeing out there with what's happening from a big picture, from a science perspective. I saw in the early 2000s, like 2002, 3, 4, 5, like really the bay getting back to what I thought was more of its natural pristine state. And look, some of what we see out there are part of natural cycles. It seems like, right? There were probably algae blooms in the bay dating back hundreds of thousands of years, and periods of higher salinity and lower salinity. But, by damming off the Everglades and disconnecting the glades from Lake Okeechobee and the greater Everglades, the northern part of the system, has resulted in about a third. The Everglades receiving about a third of its historic water supply. So what we get these spikes of way too little water throughout the year. The consistent 12 months of the year we don't get, and the effect of that is we have this natural limestone underground composition of the southern half of the state. And normally when we're getting the right amount of water going south 12 months of the year, that limestone gets saturated, and we're not as prone to these spikes of these major drought periods where we have all this damage being done, like we had in the late 80s and we had again in 2015. So when the system is dry, generally speaking, then you have a drought on top of that, the bay gets nothing. Like nothing, even a little bit of water just doesn't make it down there because the ground just sucks it up. And what I've seen over the years is, especially recently, it just seems like it's harder for the bay to recover from these events. And there just seems like, anecdotally, again, there's just less resiliency. And even now we're 2022, so 7 years since the last major seagrass die-off event. And what I still see is areas of the bay, especially the east side of the bay, like the main shoreline from Flamingo east to Cape Sable, where you get a lot of water transfer, tidal transfer. You would think that those areas would recover the fastest. I mean, there's areas in that part of the bay that have no grass still, that are like sandbars, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I can't quite figure out, but the grass isn't coming back in those areas, even though like in some of the parts of the bay, like Snakebite, and some of the areas further east. I think I said, sorry, what I meant to say was further west was where it's not coming back. We are seeing a lot more grass coming back, even though there's a question of is that the historic the turtle grass that provides a lot more surface area for biodiversity, or is that shoal grass that comes back a lot faster but doesn't have that density and the high biodiversity? So, I guess the big picture, if you ask me what I've seen over the 30 years or so I've been fishing the bay, is some of these changes seem to be maybe more long term. And the harder you are on the resource, it's harder to come back incrementally over time, and it takes longer from these events for it to bounce back. And maybe it's not bouncing back the same, truly to its natural state. And we might be starting to change the long term composition of the bay, at least from what I'm seeing.
Yeah, that's great perspective, Dave. And I'm going to have Dr. Jen check your homework in a second, but I want to
Please do. She's the expert.
I'm going to pull up a slide that illustrates the really long-term recovery that occurred after the 1987 die-off. And this is courtesy of Dr. Jen. And what we're wondering now is whether the 2015 die-off and followed by Hurricane Irma will also lead to a long-term problem and recovery. So I'll let you weigh in on that, Jen.
Yeah, I think, Dave, you're exactly right in so many fronts. That 15 years, you can see here by 2000, we're starting to see that seagrass recovering. And depending on where you were in the bay, by 2006, 2009, we have the amount of grass and the tillandsia, the turtle grass, back at high biomass that we had pre-disturbance. So that took a long time. The haladuli, the shoal grass, comes in first. And it's a wonderful species because it's more resilient. It can tolerate more variation of conditions. It can tolerate high salinity, low salinity. It's just a trooper when it comes to coming back to conditions that are tough. And then tillandsia comes in and it has a giant more biomass and it can sequester more nutrients and grab a lot more nutrients because it just builds all that root and rhizome. So it can be very effective at grabbing those nutrients. But we want that diversity of species that gives us, more resilience. So whatever conditions we have both species. Hopefully we have more than the two species. We have these grasses that like low salinity in the rim of the bay, and that whole thing gives us resilience. So as conditions change, one of these seagrass species can stick it out. And the concern is, are we in for the long road again of 20-year recovery and a long process of recovery that's punctuated by these blooms that slow down growth and take a hold and kind of slow the recovery, and perhaps this sediment that continues to linger and sort of prevent or slows down that recovery of seagrass, frustrating and slow. And like you said, in that area of that northwestern part of the bay, we're seeing some seagrass. We don't study that area that well. There's no routine monitoring that takes, that like Johnstone Key Basin is monitored pretty well, but that area, there's no seagrass sampling there. And anecdotally, it was the best baby sea trout nursery, and that's gone. It's just, we have lost that baby sea trout nursery. Most of the baby sea trout were produced in that area, and the seagrass has gone along with it. And the sediment that's also coming in from that Cape area and the Lake Ingraham area, there's a contribution there. We know that the channel to Flamingo is filling up, so we are seeing all that sediment moving around and mobilizing. And it's going to be hard for the grass to take hold under those conditions.
What will be the determining factors, in your opinion, as to whether we're in for a long-term, possibly 20-year long recovery, or whether we can make some policy decisions to accelerate that?
I think, the pace at which seagrass is recovering is a big determinant, because if the seagrass is able to take a strong hold and come back in some of these basins that Steve was mentioning, we are out of sight and out of mind, then we can start turning the corner and go in the right trajectory. The basins that are being monitored, like Rankin, are looking good. Johnson is looking a little bit better. But there are places like, First National Bank, we lost the grass there a long time ago. And that's that area is really, really murky, lots of sediment, and it doesn't look in that area in the channel, the Flamingo Channel is very challenged by the sediment. So if I had a magic wand, I would take away all that sediment and bring more fresh water, bring more sponges, and let the seagrass come back.
Yeah, I guess I'll weigh in on a couple of policy thoughts. One is Friends of the Everglades has been working for more than 3 years on the new Lake Okeechobee plan, with one of the goals being to send more clean water south to Everglades National Park, with the hopes that some of it will make it to Florida Bay. I don't want to misrepresent. LOSM, the new lake plan, is not going to be a panacea for the Bay, but that's certainly been one of our priorities, sending more clean water south through the new lake plan. And then another policy point that I know Steve is familiar with is protecting the seagrass we do have. So there was a seagrass mitigation bill filed in the Florida legislature this past session. And, it would have We confirmed through sources that DEP admitted it would have accelerated the destruction of the remaining seagrass we have by allowing more development in existing seagrass beds. So we expect that bill to come back up again this year, because bad ideas don't die in Tallahassee. They just go dormant for a little bit. So we'll be on that. But Steve, feel free to chime in on the policy aspects, Steve, because I know you track that. But I also want to hear how this has impacted your business. You're out on the water hundreds of days of the year guiding, right?
Yeah, just to talk a little bit about that policy, it's interesting to me to see how a situation like LOSUM is a study based on years of modeling, math, studies, and yet there is resistance from the smallest stakeholder that claims to be one of the biggest proponents and helpers of clean water for the Everglades. And yet a one-page bill for a seagrass mitigation gets through committee, or almost gets through committee, and whether their heart was in the right place about the idea of it, that something like that could get traction, lest people like us not stand up and say, hey, we can't grow seagrass yet. We don't know how to do it. So how are you going to mitigate it and grow it somewhere else? As just a point on all that. As far as how it's affecting the way and impacting the way that the fishery, again, it can go down to the prey and the predators, and what I think people aren't really realizing about it is when you have these algal blooms and they shift, it causes us to move where we're going to fish, whether that's up to Biscayne Bay, or whether that's down to the Lower Keys, or whether that's around downtown Islamorada. So it's creating undue pressure on fishing areas that wouldn't necessarily have that pressure, because people would be more spread out and fishing those spots. The Everglades National Park came out with their study, Jen, about this algal bloom from July. I don't know if it was if they did the study in July or they came out with it. And the epicenter of that bloom was around the Arsenickers, which is essentially the southwest corner of the Everglades National Park. And I had taken some representatives from the Everglades Foundation to go and take a look at it, and it was gin clear and beautiful around that area. There were baby tarpon around, gorgeous, clean, flushed out water. That's a unique area to the bay because you get Gulf tides and ocean tides there. So 1,000 yards away, the tide could be doing something totally different. Well, sure enough, when we went closer to Rabbit and Rabbit Key Basin, that bloom was still there. It was still nasty, pea soup, the color of this shirt. And if you wouldn't know any better, you might think that it's just wind driven off the flats, what have you. That's what I learned when I got here in 2000, when that event in the 80s was just getting over. That was still happening in Rabbit Key Basin. And I asked somebody about it, and like, man, there's a lot of mud and disturbance. And they go, dude, that's an algae bloom. So I think it really takes folks understanding and really putting forth the effort to educate themselves on what's going on there. One of the other things that I'm getting a lot of complaints about, or observations from the members of the Florida Keys Fishing Guides Association, is there is a tremendous shark situation. I don't want to call it a problem, but it's a situation. Again, could be cyclical, could be every 5 years, 50 years, 5,000 years, who knows? But maybe because there's not as many of the forage fish around, these apex predators are coming in and they're feeding on the much bigger prey, the snook, the tarpon, the redfish, what have you. Dr. Jen mentioned the sea trout. I happen to think that the sea trout are the canary in the coal mine. If they're not there and they're not around, there's something really wrong with that situation. So we've had bounce backs, we've had struggles, but that's one of the things I'm always gauging. If I see a healthy sea trout population, I'm pretty happy about it. Our bonefish population is getting better now because of maybe some efforts put in place about understanding where these fish spawn, where the juvenile fish congregate, And so now I'm getting more excited about catching a 2.5 pound bonefish than almost when I was catching 8 pound bonefish 15 years ago. That's a good sign. It's interesting that we're not seeing as many big ones, but hopefully we will. So undue pressure on other areas. We've got to deal with sharks. We have to be extra careful now when we're fishing around sharks, when we're releasing fish. I try not to take fish even out of the water, certainly this time of year with the water temperatures the way they are. A big snook, I don't even take them out of the water. Try not to take bonefish out of the water, because you'll be on a flat, you'll release that fish, and in 10 minutes, you'll see something happen on the flat, and you'll know in your heart that was the fish that you just might have taken out of the water, taken a quick photo of, and just released them quick because you didn't want to get your hand bitten because of the sharks under the boat. So it's forcing us to even move where we're fishing. So that's been tremendously frustrating.
Steve, is it affecting your business? I know we're in Stewart, Friends of the Everglades, and 2016, 2013, and 2018, when the algal blooms here became an economic issue, that's when policy response emerged. And I'm just wondering if you're seeing cancellations yet because of conditions, or is it not to that point?
Eve, it's not to that point yet. It's been interesting the last handful of years because of the pandemic. We had a real struggle, but I think with people being cooped up and not being able to travel, we had a tremendous boom for our business. All the while, the guides might be griping on the dock about the difficulty of, say, just a half a day. A half a day, you might be able to stay closer to the dock, not use as much fuel. And now we might need to be going further out or driving up and down the road to find other productive areas if that particular day and those tides aren't going to be given to whatever it is that client wants to do. I think this year in particular, Dave and I were talking right before we went live, it seems to be a normal slowdown for the fall. I haven't been as busy as I've normally been. There's the tournaments are still going on. There's still people out there. There's people getting out and catching some tremendous fish every single day. So it seems to be we're in a little bit more of our non-tourist season routine. I'm not personally getting cancellations because of fishing conditions. As a matter of fact, in our last general meeting, I reopened up a serious discussion that our members are going to contemplate in terms of possibly having a volunteer catch and release only in the Everglades National Park for all members of our organization. And I think that would be a tremendous statement, not to say that we're in dire straits, but that we're inherently a conservation organization. We don't want to work ourselves out of a job. So in the tough times, we know that we'll still be able to catch fish in the park.
Interesting.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, it is. So we're getting some questions on YouTube and Facebook that we'll get to in our last 10 or so minutes here. And please, if you have questions, pop them into the chat on either platform. Before we do, though, Dr. Jen, I want to ask you about what type of algae this is. This is not toxic algae as we saw in the northern estuaries in 16 and 18. Tell us a little bit about what you know about this type of algae in Florida Bay.
Yeah, we have a little formidable little critter in the bay. It's a Synechococcus. It's the scientific name. It's a blue-green algae. And blue-green algae are a type
Spell
of
that,
bacteria.
please.
There'll be a quiz. It's got a lot of C's, Captain Steve. So it's a blue-green algae, which means it's a bacteria that can photosynthesize, and it sort of harness light, and it can make food from light and harness and sort of make nutrients, make their own food using light. It's not toxic, unlike some of the blooms that we're familiar with for cyanobacteria elsewhere. So it doesn't produce any neurotoxins, but it can have negative effects in the sense that we can think of it as a harmful algal bloom because it can reduce light conditions that are so important for seagrass as we were discussing. And it can also consume oxygen. And oxygen is a critical part of the fish of life, the life of fish, I should say. Critical part of the quality of life of fish, and where fish are is going to be determined by oxygen levels. And also, if we have less oxygen, we can get a release of nutrients from the sediment. We can change a bunch of chemical reactions that are happening at the sediment water interface, and that anoxia, that when algae consume a lot of oxygen, they go through these fast cycles and they crash and they just consume a lot of oxygen in the process, we can get a release of nutrients, which can fuel, algal blooms in the future. This little guy is super resilient. It can grow with very few nutrients. So it can do it can grow where other algae cannot grow. And in fact, there's nothing that can compete with it, with the conditions we have in the bay. So it's doing really well under the harsh conditions of the bay. It can tolerate high salinity, low salinity. It likes it hot. So cold winters are a good thing to try to keep them down or decrease their abundance. But it's a very forward little critter, because once it takes hold, it doesn't get competed by other algae, and it doesn't get eaten. Sometimes we have algae, we have these blooms, and there are lots of these little zooplankton, little critters that love algae, but this one is not very tasty, so it doesn't get eaten. So we're now stuck in this, very resilient, very hardy species that doesn't seem to be going away.
Interesting. So in the northern estuaries, we've grappled with microcystin, which is toxic. It can be aerosolized, airborne. A lot of concerns about public health with the algae blooms we've had in the northern estuaries and on Lake Okeechobee. So it sounds like it's not so much a public health threat in Florida Bay, but nonetheless, it's really concerning in terms of the ecosystem and the economy. Okay, Dave, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to open it up for audience questions. So, as you know, Dave, there's a phrase that sometimes gets attributed to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. She's not actually the first one who said it, but it's saving the Everglades is a test. If we pass, we may get to keep the planet. And I was thinking about that phrase before this conversation, because Florida Bay feels like a microcosm within the Everglades, right? So what can the policy decisions we make in Florida Bay and the conditions in Florida Bay tell us about the bigger picture of clean water in Florida and protecting our ecosystem in Florida?
That's a big one. Look, I think it's just a simple matter of, will our elected officials and our policymakers, will they do what is right, and what benefits Floridians and the majority of us out here who live here, who work here, who spend time on the water, who also are here because they want to because we want our future generations to also enjoy the things that we were so lucky to grow up with, right? Decisions of policy could be crafted around that goal, or decisions in policy can be swayed by political donations and lobbyists, right? And the fact of the matter is, over the last 10 years that I've been paying attention to this issue, it's probably been a lot more of the second than the first. Luckily, things are changing, right? I mean, just the fact, hey, we're here right now having this conversation with a lot of people watching and paying attention and really understanding these issues is fantastic. And that's really, it's a huge step. It's just enough people watching, paying attention and figuring out, hey, look, these issues are at a tipping point, not just in the Everglades, but across Florida. This is a state where we've sort of allowed a small handful of corporate polluters, whether it's U.S. Sugar, Florida Crystals, FP&L, to become very, very, very involved, overly involved in our decision-making process, and without a lot of transparency and sunlight. But that's changing a lot. So I'm encouraged by the progress. I think I say it all the time, and I think everybody should echo it to all our friends, our family, others around us who care about these resources like we do. If we all just did something, just one thing to try to change the status quo, to try to make, whether it's education, whether it's pressuring politicians to make the right decisions, whether it's getting kids out there or somebody out there who's never experienced the resources, and hey, that's one more person who now cares about fixing these issues because they care about the resource, they know what's out there. I think we could fix this thing because Mother Nature is just incredibly resilient, more resilient than I think most of us ever give her credit for. That's the one theme that I've heard echoed by all the scientists I've ever talked to, and the people who have spent a lot more years out of the water than me, is when we let the water go where it wants to go, and we kind of we stop trying to engineer our systems, for other reasons, and we kind of allow things to maintain their natural state. Nature comes back. It really does. I mean, we've seen it so many times. So I am confident these are issues that can be fixed. But if there is a timeline to everything, right? And like I mentioned earlier, if we keep pummeling our resources and we don't let the water go where it wants to go, where it's supposed to go, eventually it's just going to get harder and harder to fix these issues, right? The solutions are there today. We just have to implement them. We know what needs to be done.
Right. It boils down to water management and water quality, and we're making some progress in terms of water management, not enough, but some, and we're pushing for more. Water quality has not been sufficiently addressed in the state of Florida, and that is where we really need to put pressure on our elected officials. So
yeah, and it comes down to political will,
mm-hmm.
and the more people care about this, the more people get loud, the more political will there will be naturally.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, we're going to get to some audience questions now. So Allie Hartman is behind the scenes, our communications director, queuing them up for us. So we have a question from Mike Connor. Hi, Mike, former Stewart resident, former Indian River keeper, actually. He says, Jen, are we seeing a regime change in Florida Bay? We have seen it in the Indian River Lagoon. It's now a macroalgae estuary. What do you think?
Goodness, no, he's not going to round it to soften that blow. It's a big question in our minds. The hope is this is part of the trajectory of recovery, slow, frustratingly slow, with some setbacks and seagrass, taking, maybe not recovering as fast, slowed down by conditions, and that we're in a trajectory of recovery because the densities keep getting higher every year. That we are, we're not going to be seeing a regime shift, but that is the positive outlook. The worst case scenario is that we're seeing these regime shifts across many of our estuaries. Biscayne Bay is on the brink of a regime shift, that all have to do with nutrient inputs, right? And sort of that are piling on as we develop and engage in human activities and have wastewater treatment and ag and all of that stuff. Now, Florida Bay is really lucky because we don't have human establishment and some of those other challenging nutrient issues with wastewater treatment and septic systems and ag right there on our front. So we're very fortunate. And our hope is that because of that, we can sort of get into that trajectory of recovery, but we need more fresh water to do so. We need those freshwater deliveries to keep that hypersalinity down, to allow that seagrass to come back and hopefully flush out the system a little bit.
Thank you. Okay, we'll take the next question. Jim Keys asks, what's the main source of nutrients for the algal blooms in Florida Bay? Also a good question. Jen, would you like to take that?
We have a lot of nutrients that are sediment. So whenever it's kind of the lack of capacity to harness the nutrients. So we have nutrients in our sediments, and we don't really need external sources of nutrients. The moment the seagrass is not there to harness all of that sediment and make it into all of those nutrients and make it into biomass and hold onto the sediment and sort of harness all of those nutrients and grab them. We don't have a lot of, it's not a nutrient-rich system, but whatever nutrients are there, we are usually harnessed by the grass. If the grass is not there, is when we get into trouble and we get that availability of nutrients that promotes the blooms.
Jen, so that sediment is that decomposed or decomposing seagrass, and how long does that last inside of the system?
Yeah, we have biomass. We have so much biomass of seagrass, right? And then that decomposes and dies naturally, and it contributes to organic matter, and that decomposes and has some nutrients that build up in the sediment. Usually that's all a closed system because the seagrass grows and goes back and grabs it. but we get into trouble when we lose that seagrass biomass.
So we lost so much seagrass back in 2016 and probably 17. But that was now 6 years ago, 7 years ago. I mean, at what point does that sediment from that is this sediment we have now still kind of clogging up our basins and our ditches? That same sediment from that seagrass, or is this part of a sort of a perpetuating system problem that there's new seagrass dying off continuously?
Yeah, we don't really know the answer. There might be some sources of sediment from the Cape. Those blow-up photos that Eve showed us speak to sediment that's being flushing in and out of these canals that are old canals that are being plugged and are scheduled to be plugged. So there might be a sediment source there, can be really important in bringing in sediment to the Flamingo Channel. And then once we lose the grass from the bottom, that sediment just resuspends with every wind event, like Captain C was describing, right? And it just resuspends over and over. Depending where the wind comes in, you can see that sediment plume moves east, it moves west, and mixes with the algal bloom in the east. It comes back to the west. And as he described, we have more seagrass loss, that we know about and we have accounted for.
That's really the problem with. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, in seagrass loss that we never recovered from the 1987 event in some places.
That's the problem with the fishing that I'm sure Steve would corroborate. I mean, there's good fishing out in Florida Bay, from time to time. And any given day you can go out there and have a phenomenal day and the water can be clean and there's fish everywhere, but it's just not consistent like it should be or like it used to be. Because you get a little bit of west wind or south wind or even like an incoming tide combined with just the slightest bit of wind, and the water just gets so milky you can't see a fish in 6 inches of water.
All right, we'll take another question. Domenica Ventura asks, do you think algal biocides are part of this picture?
Ooh.
Oh, let me take this one.
Please do.
No, Jen, really.
Oh, goodness. These options that are interventions are really expensive and really, they're going to be really hard to implement and be successful. You have to do them at such a scale that I don't think we're there. I think we have prototypes of things like that, but it's really hard. It's I think a much easier route, right, to bring us more fresh water and just let's fix the ecosystem that way with greater freshwater deliveries, which just still doesn't address the issue of if we can kill the algae, we might give seagrass a stronghold and kick things up. But hopefully we can do the same by doing sponge recovery, sponge restoration and bringing the sponges back, by bringing those freshwater flows that prevent salinity, those high salinities, and hold more oxygen, keep us from anoxia, prevent the low salinity algae from dying.
Yeah.
So the natural route, I'm always in the let's let nature take its course and give the bay what it needs from that natural perspective.
Yeah.
And I'd like to add here just real quick. I think on that same aspect, the way that we can accelerate this is to get the people voted in office that are going to support this 100%, that are going to have the political will, as Dave described, to do what's needed, not only for the Florida Bay, but for all of Florida. If the Florida Bay collapses, I'm sorry, the entire economy collapses of South Florida. And why the politicians haven't grabbed onto that, it's because follow the money. So we need to get the right people in place that are going to do what they say. They're going to save the Everglades. They're going to save South Florida. They're going to let the aquifers fill back up again. And I think that's going to be really the quickest way to let the recovery begin.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'll just add real quick. We have a long history in Florida of treating the symptoms rather than treating the disease, and using algicides to treat harmful algal blooms in Florida really can be problematic. In fact, the Blue-Green Algae Task Force that was appointed by Governor DeSantis did recommend some use of quote unquote innovative technologies to treat algal blooms. However, the way it's been implemented is with very little safeguards. And this same task force of scientists, academics, has recommended kind of a peer review process to make sure we're not causing any unintended consequences when we deploy these technologies or algicides. And that simply has not happened. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of snake oil salesmen out there who want to peddle their algicide, their technology to douse these blooms, put the fire out. But we really don't know what the long-term impacts are. And we're much more focused on preventing the disease or addressing the disease, not just the symptoms.
Just to add to that, look, there's a reason that these problems have been going on for so long and have not been fixed, right? And there's people in the state and groups in the state who benefit tremendously from the status quo, and those people in those groups seem to really like when we focus on the symptoms and not the root of the problem, right? And the fact of the matter is, we can plant as much seagrass or as many oyster beds or dump as much algicide in the water as we possibly can, but if we don't tackle these problems at their root, and as it relates to this issue, that just means restoring that historic clean water supply to the Everglades, from the upper Everglades. I mean, we're not going to fix this, and we're just going to be spinning our wheels on treating symptoms.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we might have time for one more question, Allie, if you have one more, and then I think we'll wrap up because we're already a minute over, but great discussion. Thank you, guys. Okay, last question from Bill Kearney. Is blue-green algae occurring elsewhere in the state? Biscayne Bay?
Yeah, so as we know from, you guys up in Stewart and on the west side, algal blooms are kind of our new reality, a new part of our lives, right? And they've inserted themselves into our lives because of nutrient access. And all of our estuaries, wherever we are in Florida, Bill, like we're in a different trajectory of dealing with these nutrient issues, which eventually result in algal blooms. In Biscayne Bay, we have seen, there's a 2019 study that has shown that the increase in algal blooms they looked at 20 years of data, and they've shown that we have seen a significant increase in nutrients throughout the bay in algal blooms. So the chlorophyll A levels are higher. And along with that, with seagrass loss, it's very concerning in many, many regions of the bay. Not just their obvious places we've been documented, but we're seeing, the more we look, the more we're seeing seagrass loss in the bay. And so that's a concern, and it's part of this amalgam of too many nutrients, seagrass loss, algal blooms, and all our estuaries are struggling. And that is a huge issue that needs lots of attention.
Yeah, not only a problem in Florida, but nationwide and worldwide. The Great Lakes have suffered with it, many freshwater lakes around the country. So we've really got to limit the nutrient inputs, to Jen's point. Okay, so I'm going to go around the horn here just to give you each some brief kind of final takeaways for our audience. For those who've been listening and learning about what's happening in Florida Bay, what would you want them to walk away from this conversation remembering and doing? And Captain Steve, I'm going to start with you. Oh, and you're muted.
I would just like to reiterate the fact that the fishing is still good in the Florida Bay and the Everglades and in South Florida. People should come. They're going to see some great things. And I think more and more every time we're going out on the water, we're educating people about this, because it's not just a local problem. And I'm seeing that more and more. People are really enjoying understanding, how the plumbing works, why things are happening. And I think then that lends itself to people knowing who the proper leadership is that are going to act accordingly to make sure that we can preserve this for all time. So thanks for having me on. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thanks for all you do and all of Florida's Guides do in terms of educating people. You really are an incredible resource for the environmental community in the state. Dr. Jen, I'll give you final words.
Well, I think, just following up on the discussion we were just having, which is so important, our estuaries are the powerhouse of our economies for Florida. Throughout the state, wherever we are, those estuaries, those coastal waters, with mangroves and salt marshes, they're the powerhouse or economy that drives productivity, it drives fishing, it drives recreation, it drives our ecosystems, and they need some love. They need some love. They need some attention, and we need to address these issues. They're exemplified by Florida Bay, where things are a little bit simpler because we don't have people living on the bay, and those nutrient inputs are not as bad. And that's why we should fix Florida Bay, because it's a little easier of a challenge. Things get a lot hairier when we start thinking about 2.6 million living around the bay for Biscayne Bay. So our estuaries need some love, and I'm hoping that they get that from our politicians and our leaders.
Yeah, it's a great point about Florida Bay. There are fewer variables there, so we absolutely have the opportunity to save it and should. Dave, final words for our audience?
Sure. I would say it's important to stay positive on these issues and recognize that Mother Nature is resilient, like I mentioned before, and do one thing to try to make a difference and try to get those around you to get engaged and involved. And also, I'm honored to be on the board and part of Friends of the Everglades in particular, because Friends of the Everglades is an organization that we've always taken pride, and Friends of the Everglades has always taken pride in attacking these problems aggressively at their root. So please support Friends of the Everglades and organizations like Friends that are really aggressively trying to fix these issues, not just existing, to say, hey, look, like we're doing some stuff. But this is an urgent issue and needs to be tackled. I think that's the only approach that's going to work. So, and if you're tuned in today, you're already supporting us. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. We don't have a lot of time left for compromised positions in Florida that don't do enough to address these issues we're talking about. So we do strive for more, and appreciate you highlighting that, and appreciate all of you joining us today for this conversation. Thanks to our audience, and we'll be in touch. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye.